Hello, hello. So I have the very difficult job of trying to give you a decade of cybersecurity knowledge in 20 minutes. So I will fail. And that will be the theme of this whole talk. Unanswered questions. Security is a business of risk. Security is a business of being uncertain. Security is a business of being curious. And so we will go deep into those uncertainties, that risk today as part of this conversation. So the first thing I would love to do is just give you a sense in terms of who I am as a speaker. Why am I talking to you about these unanswered questions? And where does it come from? It comes from over a decade of investing into cybersecurity startups before I started my own company called AKA Identity. It comes from starting a nonprofit focused on bringing together some of the best and brightest cybersecurity leaders in the world, over 200 of them. It comes from writing for 5 years, 50 talks and articles. So I guess this is the next one as well. And it comes from also writing the VC Field Guide. The VC Field Guide is a who, what, when, where, why, and how of venture capital. How do you know what ideas are ready to be funded? How do you know which companies are interesting? The great people at Black Hat MEA actually hosting a book signing for the VC Field Guide tomorrow. I would love to give you a signed copy then. And then most recently, in the last 6 months, I've founded a startup. And with my relationships and what we'll be talking about later today, we've already had 200 interviews around what is identity. So as you can probably guess, one of the 10 unanswered questions, of course, is identity. And of course, we're going to talk about that later. But what I'm most focused on today is to distill as much knowledge as I can from the decade of investing in cybersecurity startups and to sharing it with you, the audience. All right. One way I think we can do to speed through all this knowledge is to start with some frameworks. Frameworks allows us to put this knowledge into buckets, and it allows you to easily remember it and recall it later on, as well as see the connection between all information as well. So one framework that I love to present is visibility, intelligence, and action. You're going to see this framework over and over again in security. It is actually a relatively new one, VIA. Where it's focused on visibility, you need to see in order to do. Intelligence, figuring out what's the next step. What analysis can you do of that data to generate information? And then action. Of course, you want to make things happen. There's another version of that called the OODA loop. Observe, orient, decide, and act. Also from the military as well. Another very useful one. But you can see the connection between the two. You first get the data, then you analyze it, you understand it, then you action. And so the next evolution of this framework I'd love to show you is NIST CSF plus an addition. This was done by one of my great friends, Sunil Yu. He has a book called The Cyber Defense Framework. I'm actually on the back cover of that book as well. Highly recommend reading that book as well. Across the top, he has NIST CSF, NIST Cybersecurity Framework. This is from the US. And then on the second axis, he talks about 5 ways of controlling or securing your organization based on this CSF as well. What this essentially creates is a 25-box matrix where different companies, different ideas, different projects, different goals can go within them. And that allows you to start seeing the patterns, start seeing the trends. One way that customers and CISOs actually use this framework is they do red, green, yellow, where they say, hey, these are the things I'm happy with. These are the things that us as an organization, I think we need to improve as our leader of cybersecurity. And these are the things that we can hold off on because everything is okay. Not everything needs to be green. Not everything needs to be perfect. If you wanted to be perfect on all 25 boxes, you would be spending more money than you know what to do with. And it would, with anything in risk, there's always a limit in terms of productivity. You want to be able to navigate that balance. And that is what an amazing security leader will do for you and your organization. All right, so that's the next evolution of frameworks. This is the most busy one, incredibly busy, and then it's only going to get busier from here. So think of this like a class. We're going to teach you advanced calculus, and we're going to start with really easy math, and then boom, we're talking about advanced calculus all of a sudden. So we're going to keep going down. This is going to get even more complicated over time. But the intent here is to give you as much information as possible and then to be able to distill it into a way where you can take a decade of knowledge away from just 20 minutes of conversation. So one thing I would love to show here is past, present, and then in my slides, I'm going to show you future. In the past, you can see a lot of changes, a lot of movement. And a lot of this change comes from, of course, COVID, comes from globalization, comes from remote work, and seeing how the world has changed because of it. I'm biased. I'm starting an identity company, and of course, you can see identities shooting up and it's becoming one of the #1 priorities in cybersecurity today. And of course, we're going to talk about that later on. But what's also very interesting to see is endpoint security. It's different shades of black, so it's very, very hard to see. But endpoint security was ninth, third, and then it drops off. It doesn't exist anymore. And in fact, this is one of my first unanswered questions I'm going to talk about in my slides later on, is why is that? What is life after endpoint security? What is life after EDR? And we will have some really interesting ways of talking about that. And one reason why it dropped off, one hypothesis, one uncertainty, one guess of why it's dropped off is because we are thinking about it in a whole nother way now. Instead of thinking about it as endpoint security, we're thinking about it as something else. And I'll show that to you in a little bit. But before we do that, I do want to make sure to address the top 4 that are brought up here, just so we can make sure that we're speaking the same language, you understand where I'm coming from, and you understand what's the intent of this chart as well. On the network security side, the reason why it's become #1 and why it was a high priority before, it's very much focused on future of work, very much focused on now that we're being more remote, now that we're being more global organizations, how do we secure our organizations and how do we secure the network? What is that network even in the future as well? And how can we take existing ideas, existing frameworks, existing success that we've seen in the local network, in the company network, to the future as well? The second one, IAM, 46%, essentially 50% of security leaders today expect IAM budgets to expand next year. A lot of it has to do with multiple trends. One of them is related to the amount of people is required to manage identity and access management. Identity and access management encompasses a lot of different pieces. It encompasses joiners, movers, leavers, so operations, so provisioning and deprovisioning. It includes security, making sure that you're provisioning and deprovisioning securely and effectively. And it includes compliance, making sure that you're doing it accurately so that you're not accidentally exposing information that you shouldn't be exposing. Cloud, this is very much focused on public cloud. Nowadays, when people think about, say the word cloud, they used to mean data centers, they used to mean your own hardware. Now they're always referring to what is AWS doing for me? What is Azure doing for me? What is GCP doing for me? How do we apply these different technologies in a secure way? And then fourth, application security. This one has been such an interesting one because we've seen it evolve many times over, take on many different types of words, including DevSecOps, for example. And we'll talk about that in the top 10 unanswered questions. All right, now the top 10 unanswered questions. Where these unanswered questions come from comes from being an organizer of security leaders for the past decade. I've invested in over 40 cybersecurity companies. I've mentored and coached over 50 CISOs in their careers. And I've spent a lot of time truly understanding what is the latest and greatest, who's focused on what does the future look like. And with that level of confidence, I'm able to actually show you what I believe is going to be our topics in 2024 and things that we're going to be focused on as well. And some of that is related to things that we're already focusing on now, near the end of 2023. So, past, present, future. Past, we sort of saw endpoint drop off. Why is that? What is life after EDR? Good question. This year, a lot of people have been focused on how do I take my existing budget, spend it with less vendors, or spend less money in general? And a lot of that has to do with using the same platforms. How can I use more Microsoft? How can I use more Palo Alto? How can I use more Okta, for example, or sort of some common platforms that people have been using? But what we're starting to see is the future, which is, okay, I'm using these same tools, but I still want best of breed. I still want to only use what these platforms provide me, because security is so dynamic. Things are constantly changing. Uncertainty is the default within cybersecurity as well. And so as a result, now we're starting to think about other things as, well, what about all the data that we have? How do we use these platforms? Are they consolidating the data for us? And it's because of this trend that we're seeing companies like Cisco talk about XDR. We see companies like CrowdStrike talk about XDR as well. talking about how do we take all this different kind of information, whether it's endpoint, network, cloud, application, put it all in one place and start to consolidate. And that is something a lot of us are going to be focused on and thinking about in 2024. All right, second unanswered question, when this works, I'm having fun now. Oh, there it is. Okay. So now the second question is third-party risk management, and very topical topic, especially globally, especially customers who are using Okta today. And so before we talk about that, let's go through this pattern real quick. So 2022, a lot of people were focused on how do I improve my third-party risk management process? Very inefficient, very expensive, very manual. To be realistic, I don't think we've solved that. In fact, because we didn't solve it, we've transitioned to think about other different things within cybersecurity today as well, which is in 2023, now we're thinking about which vendors are actually investing in security. How can I make sure I'm working with a vendor that actually cares? And a key example of that is Okta. Okta, because they are so fundamentally important being an identity provider, because of the different news alerts related to Okta nowadays, a lot of people are trying to understand how secure really is Okta. How much do they really care about cybersecurity as well? And this goes into the future of what's just recently happened within the US by the SEC, where they have actually given fines and made claims of inaccuracy or inadequacy as well. And now a lot of us are thinking about how do we hold vendors accountable? What's really interesting about this unanswered question is that it actually catalyzes another unanswered question that's going to show up later in the presentation, and I'm excited to talk to you about that as well. All right, next one is identity. My favorite topic. I'll go really quickly through this one because we have so many to go through. First, 2022, focus on remote-first identity. 2023, we had more people coming back in the office. Now we're thinking about how do we provide hybrid identity. And then now, 2024, I predict everyone's going to be thinking about zero trust. What is really zero trust? Now that we have solidified how we're going to do work in this future state, what can we do to start cleaning up and doing a better job in identity? And that's where there's an opportunity to do things like use identity data. Number 4, security hygiene. Security hygiene previously referred to vulnerability management, patch management. This year it evolved to figuring out back to the basics. What are the fundamental things that we can do that we've always been doing in the cybersecurity industry since the beginning of time? 2024, I believe everyone's going to be focused on the 80-20 rule. Yes, there are the basics, but there are still a ton of basics that we can't do. What are the 20% of things that we can do to achieve 80% of the value? Because unfortunately, there's budget constraints in the cybersecurity industry, and how do we make the most of the budget that we do have will be a key focus in 2024. Number 5, focus on data. So now, back in 2022, a lot of the focus was data's moving everywhere. We used to be able to keep data in databases. We used to be able to keep data contained within our networks. But then with SaaS applications, more of that data went externally. We had more things like shadow IT, for example. And then we started putting data into our public cloud companies, and then those were misconfigured and easily letting people access your data as well. And then we had applications by our vendors that had our sensitive data that were accidentally leaking our information as well. And so a lot of that has been, back in 2022, was focused on, all right, what is this new data security paradigm for this cloud-native world? How do I think about that today? And then since then, we've evolved. 2023, a lot of the focus this year has been focused on who has access to what, especially who has unnecessary access or who has irresponsible open access. So a common one is open S3 buckets, really common focus, and something that we've been trying to tackle for a long time. And then 2024, what I'm seeing in the future is it's going to be focused on what data do we have? We can't treat all the data that we have in the organization the same, because some data is very sensitive. Some data, if it's stolen, will create a business problem. Some data, if it's encrypted and we can't access it, will slow down the business. But there's also some data that we do not need to treat like everything else. And so 2024 will be focused on classifying data as well, and inventorying data. All right, 6th one, SaaS security. We talked a little bit about that. What SaaS security really is the evolution of network security. right? Because before we had these walls, we had firewalls at the edges of them, and then now we moved into this cloud-native world. 2023, this year, really focused on which SASE style are we? Are we a proxy? Are we a network agent? How are we actually securing this new network? But in 2024, because of consolidation, because of evolution in IT, because of evolution in security, because of how we're working differently now than we did in the past, it will turn into more of a conversation. What is our IT style? Do we want to be a SaaS-only company where every single application going forward is SaaS and we're going to be securing as such? Or are we going to still be a hybrid company? Are we going to maintain these mainframe applications that we built decades ago? Are we still going to have these on-prem applications that we host ourselves? And a lot of companies next year will be thinking about that and focused on that. Number 7, IT, OT, very, very hot topic back in 2022 and before, because we had so many devices. We had this explosion of different devices on our networks, and we were trying to figure out what do we do about this? How do we do it? I don't think we really solved that, to be really honest with you. I think the best place we got to was vertical by vertical type OT security, which was better and more focused. You had the breadth, you had the depth instead of the breadth. In 2023, a lot of the focus was on 5G. How does reimagining access to these IoT devices change? And in 2024, I think we're going to have an unanswered question, which is, how are we going to manage these devices? What's our fundamental mindset that we're going to use to manage these applications? Are we going to focus on asset management and having an inventory of all of them? Are we going to focus on identity management, focus on who has access to what and what do those devices have access to? And this sort of harkens back to both the IAM zero trust theme as well as the data theme that we talked about in terms of classification. Or are we going to focus on it purely in terms of security? Are we going to be focused on vulnerabilities, for example, and focus on how do we make sure that these systems, which are doing what they're doing, aren't doing things insecurely? How do we do better detection and response, for example? How do we do better configuration? So a lot of different ways, and I think 2024 will be a big unanswered question with regards to how do we manage IT and OT devices. Alrighty, number 8. This one is, we talked about this in terms of those top 4 according to this other survey, which is around application security. How do we do application security, and how is it changing? How is it evolving? In 2022, a lot of the focus was, I have so much information. How do I make sure I get the information to my, and we've heard words like shift left, for example. How do I get this information to the developers, to the people who actually have to fix the problem? Because I can't fix the problem. I'm in security. The developers who are developing application have to do it, and so that was a big focus back then. Now in 2023, we got the data to them. The developers have that information, but they have too much. Vulnerability scanners inherently give you way too much information. There's high, medium, low, and there's a lot of sort of judgment in terms of what is high, what is medium, what is low. And so now a lot of focus this year has been prioritization. And there's actually been creation of new and adoption of new ways of prioritizing vulnerabilities. For example, one has been really focused on exploitability. Not every single vulnerability out there in the world is actively exploited. I want to know which ones are actually being exploited, and I'll prioritize those first before I prioritize every other vulnerability that is out there. But what does the future look like? What are people thinking about and talking about in terms of 2024 with regards to this theme? And a key theme has been around open source lifecycle management. Open source is the fundamental pillar and that many applications are built on top of. And so now the focus is, how do we shift left even further in terms of managing open source more accurately and more responsibly as well? I have 1 minute left and 2 more slides. I think we timing with here was really good. I'm really proud. All right, so back in 2022, cyber insurance got very expensive. So many ransomware breaches, so many incidents, so much money being funded, so many payments that had to be made. And as a result, cyber insurance became very expensive. In 2023, a lot of CISOs were thinking, how do I make sure I pay as little as possible, because I don't want to be paying for insurance that I might not be using. But things have been changing. We talked a little bit about third-party risk management. How do I hold my vendors accountable? And organizations like the SEC in the US are starting to do that kind of work as well. And so now people are thinking, how do I make sure my executives are protected? How do I make sure that no one's a scapegoat for an incident that's very hard to prevent? And then lastly, privacy or data science. You probably heard the word AI in every other sentence today. That's just the reality. And so back in 2022, a lot of people were focused on how do I make sure the data science is inherently private secure. 2023, we've all been shocked and wowed by LLMs and generative AI. A lot of us have been focused on what is possible. And now 2024, the unanswered question for security practitioners is, what can we safely expose via AI? The way to think about this is AI is a UI UX layer. It is a way to take information that's already been created and to disseminate it to your audience to make it easier to use. Instead of showing them visually, they can have a conversation with information that you're doing. And so what information do we safely want to show on our website? What information do we safely want to show via an LLM or via an AI assistant? That, I think, will be the mindset, because we cannot do perfect access management on generative AI, at least not now, and perhaps someday in the future. Alrighty, so that's the top 10 unanswered questions, and in terms of history, present, and future. Thank you very much for attending my talk.